With the death of Massa, how did the situation, because that was obviously a tipping point within Iran. So how did we get to that point? Obviously, we could go back to 1979, but what would you say is the genesis of how all that's happened?
Well, you're quite right to say it's a tipping point. I mean, in the sense that it was just in many ways a sort of straw that broke the camel's back at this stage. But it's founded on a long tradition of protest in Iran, and not simply the Islamic Revolution, but prior to that.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there have been protests afterwards, as the promise of the revolution has been seen by many people not to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
And that sort of the Republican elements of the quote Islamic Republic have basically been sidelined in favor of the much more Islamic authoritarian ones. But the current protest, I think, if you want to frame it more tightly, I think the genealogy of it is really traced to the 2009 Green Movement, which was a mass protest against what many people saw as a fraudulent election by the then President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad for a second-term landslide victory, as they called it. And I tend to share the view that it was fraudulent. Actually, I mean, I wrote about it. I wrote about it quite extensively at the time.
Hmm.
But at that stage, you witnessed probably some of the largest protests that the country had ever seen. I mean, in many ways, much larger than what you'd seen in 1979, just in sheer numbers. But of course, the focus at that stage was really to do with reforming the system from within. And while that was not universal by any stretch of imagination, by and large, the drive was to reform the system from within, and of course that failed. The regime, after about 6 months of toing and froing and attempting to deal with it, eventually sort of crushed the protests, suppressed it, but also tried to rip the heart out of the sort of social movements, the civil society organizations that had driven it. So you had a period, in a sense, of what I always call sort of like an armistice. I mean, this thing, people say it was suppressed. I say, no, it's sort of like an interim period until the next round starts. But in this case, because they'd done such a thorough job at basically demolishing it, people were just physically, mentally, morally exhausted, And then you had this period when there was all the promise of the nuclear agreement with the Americans, and people thought, well, with Ahmadinejad gone and the sort of the more moderate, I should say, President Rouhani, more pragmatic, I think might be a better word, came in 2013. There was a view that, let's wait and see. There may be some results of this, maybe more of an opening up. Then, of course, that failed to deliver too. And it wasn't just Trump, by the way. I mean, people sort of focus on Trump. I think Trump was a very useful bogeyman, and he sort of walked into a once he withdrew from the agreement, he basically lent himself very easily to being the target of all the bile. I mean, it wasn't difficult. But the fact is, it sort of disguised in many ways that the agreement itself that was reached in 2015 was not delivering on many of the things that the Iranians were promised. Not necessarily by the West, by the way, but by their own leaders. So Rouhani made some very grandiose claims about what the hell was going to happen as a result of this agreement. This was a much more incremental and slow agreement, but he was sort of arguing for instant gratification almost. And of course, people got very sort of excited about it. And then after a year, they thought, crikey, not much is happening, right?
Yeah.
So by 2017, actually, you had the protests kick-started again because the economy was not getting better. There were problems with infrastructural weaknesses in the country. I mean, and this is also one of the things I really want to emphasize. The protests in 2022 come on the back of a series of crises that are sort of basically afflicting the Islamic Republic. And they're not only political, they're at heart in many ways fundamentally economic and ecological. So in 2017 and 2019, you saw some pretty serious protests emerging that had to do with the economic sort of malaise in the country. And malaise is probably too generous a term. I mean, it's pretty dire. And even worse was the ecological crisis. I mean, people were not getting drinking water and stuff like that. I mean, they were running out of water. I mean, it in the south of the country. I mean, it is pretty bad. And in 2019, for instance, one of the Minister of Interior, gave an interview, and he said, these protests were very serious because they were trying to explain. I mean, this is the way they're trying to. They said, why did we shoot so many people? I mean, basically, there's a view that they, the assessment is certainly by some anyway that upwards to about 1,500 people were killed. Okay, this is not insignificant. Okay, Amnesty International goes for what they can actually, document. So that's about 300. But the trouble is what you can document and what goes on in the country. The trouble is, and this is one of the things, we're always groping around in the dark with Iran. There's not really access,
Mm.
So other people were making, on other assessments, it was much, much higher. And I tend to lean towards the higher figure again, because simply of what I know about the country. So, and the Minister of Interior gets on television. He says, we had to take very drastic measures. This was trying to explain why they shot so many people. And in trying to explain this, he basically said the state faced an existential threat. So he effectively admitted the situation was far worse than any of us realised. Because he said, these protesters were very well organised. They could target key aspects of the state infrastructure. And he basically highlighted the fact that the state infrastructure is extremely weak and vulnerable. I mean, that's basically what he was saying.
Mm.
So if you were a protester in Iran, by the way, you'd look at these ministers' comments and you think, oh, maybe we're more effective than we thought. I mean, it was a very odd way for the minister to carry on. But nonetheless, this is what happened. Then you have COVID, which basically, kills it dead again, because obviously nobody can go out. So, everyone's at lockdown. And so if you look at it in that sequence, the 2022 demonstrations were basically just waiting to happen. I mean, this is the thing. It wasn't, and I remember during that year, I was talking to a couple of journalists, and the background to this is that after Rouhani had disappeared, I think that was in 2021, if I remember, and then Raisi comes in. The Raisi, quote, election, and for those of you who are watching the podcast can see that I've got inverted commas. I mean, basically, it was a selection. There was nothing elected. It was the worst election in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Basically, completely rigged. I mean, all of them are manipulated. This was so blatant, and the turnout was so low. And Raisi himself is a bit of an oaf. I mean, he's a technocrat, a ruthless technocrat. His chief claim to fame is that he was a member of a death committee back in 1988, where 4 of them went around doing extrajudicial, basically summary executions of political prisoners. And he's never denied it, by the way. I mean, this is the beauty of him. He says, when the tough calls need to be made, I'm there. I mean, that's basically what he says.
They find a way to condone their awful behavior.
Yeah, I mean, basically, he doesn't deny. Other people have denied it. He sort of says, but I'm a man. I'm the man for the tough jobs. I mean, he takes pride in that. So the situation was pretty. And one of the things they instituted in 2022, once obviously the COVID restrictions were being lifted and whatever, and people were going out, they then realised that there's a real lack of attention to the veil, the hijab. So Raisi decided, I'm gonna clamp down on this. I'm gonna show him a tough guy. He's basically like a good old conservative, and he, hardline conservative in the Iranian sense, anyway. And he says, one of the things we've got to do is we've got to clamp down on the veil. And throughout the year, women were basically being beaten up. I mean, there was, I was talking to a journalist about it, and there were people coming out of prison with black eyes and this one. And I did say to someone then, I said, it's only a matter of time before someone gets killed. Because the way they're carrying on. And then lo and behold, of course, in September, that's exactly what happened. And bingo, you get this sort of explosion of anger pent up. So my point really, and sorry for this rather long-winded first answer, but my point is really that we have to see that in context. And the context is of a series of protests of which, this is the latest. And it's not just really about, as people in the West tended to think, about women's rights. Women's rights, of course, central to it, but it's much broader than that. And even women were saying that, we're not just fighting for women's rights here; we're fighting for everyone's rights. And the men who were participating, obviously, were doing that too. And so this is what happened then. And of course, it completely took the regime again by surprise. And again, as I say to people, it's died down now. They've suppressed it, but we're into the next armistice until the next round picks up. I mean, it's because for this very simple reason that they don't take any fundamental steps to address the fundamental problems affecting the system, because they think they're doing a marvelous job, and their argument is a bit like Putin in Russia, that all the problems we have here are derived from Western perfidy and intervention, whatever. I mean, there was a minister recently came out, or not a minister, but a senior official came out, and he listed 22 countries that were involved in the protests, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, obviously Britain, obviously America, France, Germany, most of the EU, to be honest. They just listed them all out, but they won't take responsibility themselves. They say, and because they don't take responsibility themselves, they don't see any reason to change the ways.
Right. That's crazy. I seen a video of them talking, and there was like a load of people that were shouting like "Death to the West" and all this kind of stuff, and they were blaming like they were blaming the attacks, like you're saying, like it was orchestrated by the West, and they had people in there and all. Sorry, not the attacks, the protests. They were saying like the West did it, and I'm thinking, how many people actually believe this? Like the
Well, not many. I mean, this
yeah,
is the problem. I mean, it's basically what they're talking to us. They're talking to their own, and and you know, one of the interesting things about the recent developments is how, you know, Russia and Iran are now sort of tied together because the Iranians have sort of backed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and this
yeah,
is a monumental act of stupidity, by the way. But you know, there you go. I mean, you can't. And so they've just and so they've blended in this sort of thing. You know, they sort of see the entire thing as part of a Western. And you know, I was reading some stuff recently. I mean, there's a guy I think who's gone in and said that, you know, the war in Ukraine is basically I mean, interestingly, they completely reverse. You know, it's black is white and white is black. Is basically an example of the Western, you know, proxy war against Russia. I mean, you know, but this is something they believe, and they talk to their own, and they try and convince themselves. And the Iranians believe this as well, and they sort of think that everything is really dictated by a Western conspiracy. Sadly, there are some people in the West who feed this. But as you quite rightly say, you know, it's this idea that, you know, in Dublin and London and Edinburgh and Paris, and I mean, I said to someone, I said, well, most people in the West aren't paying a huge amount of attention, actually, to be honest. And the governments have got many other things on their plate at the moment. So, and you know, the focus, as we know, is Ukraine. Actually, I mean, it's not Iran. So, but it's just not something. It's just not. It's just not the way it works. I mean, it's so. But the sad thing is because they refuse to see, certainly publicly, refuse to see any error in their own behaviour. They're not going to take any measures to address it, and as a consequence, as night follows day, I will tell you now that a protest will be not too far in the future. Something else will happen, and something else will spark something off, and then that way it will build up again. And if you look at from 2017, the shorter term look from 2017 to now, you know, every layer, every group of people, every class of people, in a way, in Iran has been involved. And one of the critical things about it, and you know, we can look about it in comparative frameworks, you know. Is that the regime has lost its narrative. I mean, it's
okay,
lost the narrative with the people. So it goes to your point, you know, do the people believe it? No, not really. Nobody does anymore. And the regime is struggling to make that basically believed by anyone. And I think once you lose the narrative, you know, you're on a hiding to nothing, really. I mean, it's a matter of time. Yes, they can use brute force, but their authority is waning. And ultimately, for a system to exist in the long term, it needs to be founded on a measure of authority.
yeah,
Now, these things, I have to tell you, these things are so hard to measure in a sort of a metric, you know, quantifiable, that of course, for some political scientists and others, they don't like this type of talk because it's very vague. But, you know, we know from history, you know, that when you lose the narrative, you're on a hiding to nothing. You know, when you just have to look at, you know, for want of a better example, you just have to look at Britain and Ireland, for instance. Once you lose the narrative, it's finished. And to be fair, you know, the British didn't have the narrative really with many Irish people for a long time. But the point is once that, you know, once you lose control of that, once the authority wanes, it's a matter of time, really. And I think this is the same issue, you know,
yeah.
in Iran at the moment.
How do would say a lot of younger people feel about the situation, because obviously they haven't lived through the time pre 1979 when you see people you look at Iran and it's like the West, there's people out dancing and they're in normal clothes and stuff like that, so they've never lived through that time, but they obviously can look at videos and stuff like that. So how do they react to seeing that and kind of the situation that they're actually in at the moment?
When they're looking sort of abroad and seeing other things. I mean,
Well, they're
again,
no, when they're looking back at Iran in,
oh yeah, when
say,
they look, well, I mean, there's
pre
two things. Yeah,
1979.
no, so there's two things here. One is that, you know, people think they're disconnected and they're not. They see a lot of things through social media and whatever of what's going on abroad. But then also they see things quite rightly, as you say, what's happened pre-79. And one of the most extraordinary things, or impactful things, I think, has been the way in which foreign-based uh, Persian news stations are pumping out documentaries of the pre-1979 period, with women in,
Right.
basically Western clothes. And I think it has had a profound effect on people. It is a bit sort of like what we'd call, history 101. I mean, it's not exactly nuanced what they're
Hmm.
being shown.
Hmm.
There's not a lot of subtlety.
Okay.
It's a very black and white picture because obviously, there's a reason the revolution happened, right? I mean, there are,
Yeah.
the Shah mishandled things. I mean, clearly mishandled things. The last Shah, and but nonetheless, you paint it in very primary colors, and you see pre-1979, and you contrast it with the post-79 period. And of course, the longer the agony lasts, as you're seeing now,
Hmm.
the more the previous period just looks absolutely marvelous. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the thing. The perspective changes.
Yeah. All history is kind of like that, though, isn't it,
It
in a
is. It's
way?
context.
Um, so what exactly we're obviously going back, but what led to everything in 1979? Because I mean, if you're looking back at the things like for me that, I'm not an Iranian historian, so I look back on these pictures like, wow,
Mm.
that looks great crack. You know what I mean? So it could be obviously it wasn't all great crack if it's led to something.
The basic problem prior to the revolution is
Yeah, yeah.
that the Pahlavi monarchy focused, and certainly the last Shah, he focused almost exclusively on economic development. And the argument was really, it was a sort of a American inspired, shall we say, an American inspired. I wouldn't want to blame the Americans either, because I think many Americans have different views on this,
Hmm.
but certainly it was an American inspired idea that politics will develop on its own. You sort out the economics, you make people richer, you make them better off, and eventually the politics will catch up. And of course,
Right.
in many ways, this is exactly what happened, but not quite in the way the Shah wanted, because what the Shah was basically doing was he said, let's not deal with politics at all. I'm not interested in politics. I mean, he basically sort of said that, democracy is great if everyone has a PhD and everyone understands politics, but, if nobody's really intelligent enough, and I'm very intelligent, and then I'll deal with the politics, you guys deal with business and stuff.
Hmm.
Because that's not what's going to happen. If you invest heavily in education, and you pump out, hundreds of thousands of students coming out, graduates, and then you tell them, oh, by the way, though, you can't get involved in politics. What do? I mean, they just
Yeah.
become disenchanted, and it was a huge mistake. I mean, that's the basic model that I think earlier generations understood this, that political and economic reform have to go hand in hand. You have to somehow manage them stage by stage. If what you do is you just deal exclusively with economic development and actually appear to be taking retrograde steps in political sense, people become disheartened, and that's really what undermines it. So, the problem with the current comparison is that really people feel that they're politically and economically disenfranchised. So because of that, even though actually in a political sense, in some ways, people are much freer to voice their opinions,
Mm.
it's not that they can do anything about it. They can voice their opinions, but they might end up in prison afterwards. They might, whatever, but it's not, but by and large, the state is not, has not, let me put this in, let me be more specific, has not, say, for parts of its existence, the Islamic Republic has not been as politically suppressive of dissenting views as Shah was at the end of his reign. But now, increasingly, what the Islamic Republic has become is both politically and economically suppressive,
Hmm.
and people are being disenfranchised. So therefore, they look back on the pre-revolutionary period as saying, well, at least we had money and we could travel. I mean,
Yeah.
do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
If you had an Iranian passport prior 79, you didn't need visas to go halfway around the world. Now,
Right.
if you have an Iranian passport, you can't go anywhere. I mean, you just can't go anywhere. You can't even get a
Wow.
bank account, right? I mean,
Wow.
you see what I mean? It's a completely different setup. So again, as you were saying earlier, Paul, I mean, it's the context matters.
Hmm.
So in absolute terms, people will say, I mean, this is another thing people say, they say, but the economic metrics for the Islamic Republic are very good. And how do they do that? And this is the joy of statistics, of course. What they tend to do is they tend to look at the baseline as either 1979 or 1989. Now, one of the reasons the economic statistics look quite good is, one, they inherited a fairly healthy set of statistics from the
Yeah.
Shah, but also, you go through a period of war with Iraq, 8 years, and things looking pretty grim. And
Mm.
then obviously coming out of the war, suddenly growth accelerates, right? So on balance, your statistics look quite good. But as people have said, what they really should be doing is doing these statistical analyses from 1975 or 1974. And that way you can see the trends. And what people say is that, yes, in some ways, the economic trends are on the way up, but they're much slower than they might have been had you not had a revolution and a war. Yeah.
Right.
And in some
Right.
ways they're going and they're reversing. I mean, that's just the reality. But because you're framing that from 1989. I mean, I've seen some figures that come out with the most extraordinary figures of growth. But of course, when you start from zero, obviously any
Yeah.
growth is fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way. I'm sorry to say that. Uh, people manipulate the stats.
Like Iran's a very rich country. I think they have loads of gas that they actually don't
Huge,
use.
huge.
It's the Qatar that use most of the gas. Like why? Maybe I'm wrong on that, but like why
No,
do
you're
they not?
absolutely right.
Why do they not use it? Like I don't understand that.
Because they've never been able to get investment into it.
Really?
So yeah, so basically, and this is one of the tragedies you see of Iran. So Iran has huge oil and gas resources. It has the
Mm.
second largest reserves of natural gas outside Russia.
Wow.
The big gas field it shares with Qatar, and as you say, Qatar basically is busy exploiting it. But it spent all of its time. I mean, this spent all of its time really sort of developing its nuclear program on the basis that all this oil and gas is going to run out. But
Oh my
which
God.
is fine, one level. But the point is that hang on a minute, why don't you develop the gas resources? I mean, this is what the world needs, right? I mean, and they just won't. They're not interested, and because of the poor relations of the West and other things, they've just never developed it. What they've done is they've tried to maintain and keep up the oil production as far as they can, but they haven't really even begun to look at the gas. And this means that obviously, in the longer term, the country, resource wise, even, to be honest, if you were to look at incomes among a very sort of select elite, it's uh, um, they're extremely wealthy. It's not like people are poor. There's a lot of money going on. It's sloshing around. It's just the government doesn't have any money. I mean, the government itself has thrown it around. It's got very little accountability. There's very little scrutiny and auditing of what's going on. There's a huge amount of corruption. Some people are doing very, very well. The vast majority are doing very, very poorly. But in terms of, I think, as you rightly point out, in terms of the investment into the economic infrastructure of the country, they just have absolutely neglected it. And the clearest indication of this, of course, is water. Iran is one of the few Middle Eastern countries that actually enjoys a sufficient water resources of its own. It's not dependent on river flowing from other places for an industrial takeoff. But the trouble is, the rain obviously falls in the wrong places.
Right.
So you've got
Right.
to have an irrigation and network of water, which they've always had. I mean, historically, the Iranian plateau has been irrigated effectively, by large sort of like irrigation projects. But of course, they've neglected it, which is why you're finding water's running out, and this sort of they use a lot of very water intensive agriculture, pistachios and other sort of things, which take a huge amount of water, and they're not actually refilling. They're not building enough reservoirs, other things, but also in managing the water. But this is a emblematic, as you say, of a wider failure to invest in economic infrastructure, still less the political infrastructure, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
What they're doing, as I feel in my way, is they're an extractive state. They're an extractive state par excellence. They take out, but they don't really put back in. And sooner or later, that's going to come home to roost as well. And as I say, I like to. It's not just economic. The economic example is one that you can see.
Yeah.
The political one is the one that you don't see. And again, that goes back to that notion of the loss of narratives, the loss of authority. This is because they just don't. They're not. What they do is they rabbit on about things that their own crew like. Palestine.
Right.
The hidden imam is about to return. All sorts of religious mumbo jumbo, as far as I'm concerned. And obviously their own crew like it. But the vast majority of the population, probably 90% of the population, don't believe it. And some people actually detest it. So how does that sustain itself? Now,
Yeah.
you could if on a Chinese model, for instance, you said, but we deliver on the economic, we
Yeah.
deliver a good standard of living, but they don't. So,
So it's kind
you
of
know,
unsustainable, really.
that's what I think. I mean, that's what I think. I mean, other people will disagree and they sort of think, well, you can muddle on. You can muddle on. I mean, but sooner or later, and one of the things we found in the last protests was that one of the problems they had was they were finding it difficult to pay, people. I mean, a lot of the economic protests coming out now are basically because people can't be paid. So it's interesting. People say to me, "Oh, a revolution only happens when people are well off enough to afford to go on strike." But what I was saying is, what if they're so badly off that they're not even getting paid at all?
Yeah.
I mean, surely that also is an encouragement to go on strike. There's a sort of there's the two extremes, right?
Yeah.
And it's clear to me that if the government is running out of money to pay its security forces to oil the wheels, and again, it goes back to an interesting sort of the French historian de Tocqueville sort of said that revolutions only happen when things have been quite good and then start to get a bit worse. So they're going up and then they start to dip. Well, in some ways, that's also true here. You can make that case here because there was so much oil money sloshing around, 10 years ago, and people made huge amounts of money doing absolutely nothing, by the way. I mean, they just got all these pensions. And now suddenly this money's drying up. So you're finding this sort of contradiction,
Yeah.
things were going very well now. So there's all sorts of possibilities there and causes of discontent.
So what did people think was going to happen after, we say, 1979? What was the what people thought was going to become of the country? Because obviously they thought something else was going to happen. Would it?
Yeah, they
Like,
did. Yeah,
did they think it
yeah.
was going to happen? We'll say, like, for example, like Dubai, that kind of system that Dubai have, that they're not at war, but they're just like they're quite a thriving kind of country, if you know what I mean.
I think if the Shah had stayed, if the monarchy had stayed, I mean, people
Mm,
sort of assumed that the country might become a bit politically stale,
okay.
but would economically develop and continue to be a sort of a economic engine and powerhouse for most of the region. And then people assumed actually that after the Shah had died, his son would have taken over, and his son would have been a much more sort of laid back, I suppose, type of approach, and much more of a constitutional monarch. I mean,
Right.
that was a sort of optimistic assessment, that people had. I mean, I think some sort of political protest would have emerged, but perhaps not in the way that it took out. I think even the political protests that emerged, even at the time, when you read what people say, they sort of assumed that Khomeini, the religious leader, was a sort of a vehicle for a democratization of the country. I mean, it was so fanciful; it beggars belief because people really
Right.
didn't do their research. But that's what people felt. They thought, well, we'll use this guy. He's a traditional cleric, old school. He'll come in, he'll kick out the Shah, then he'll go off and retire to his religious studies, and we'll get on with developing a democracy. And it could have happened. I mean, it could have happened if they had read Khomeini's character right. But Khomeini wasn't interested in that. I mean, he's very clear what he wanted to do. So they completely misread it, were completely outmaneuvered. And of course, what you find, as in other revolutions, is you get a sort of a dual, a second revolution follows the first revolution. And
Yeah.
what you had was, initially, as a colleague of mine quite rightly says, and he argues, he says that the Islamic revolution only became Islamic in retrospect. I mean, when the revolution was started, people didn't necessarily define it as an Islamic revolution. They just thought of it as a revolution, basically to overthrow the Shah, and just to give you an idea of how absurd things were, there were American officials. I think it was Jeane Kirkpatrick, who I think was the US ambassador to the UN. I think, and I have to be careful just because, but at least one of her, and I think maybe Ted Kennedy as well. They thought Khomeini was sort of like the Gandhi of Iran. They said, "Do you see what I mean?" I mean, it was
My God.
that sort of like
Wow.
surreal, actually.
Wow.
And they thought there were things that you could do, and it was a very, very, yeah, it was it was a surreal moment. I mean, really, when you look back on it and know what happened, obviously with hindsight, some people felt that this would be a means by which Iran would finally transition to democracy.
Right.
And, ultimately the country will probably transition to democracy, but I think that the Islamic Revolution has made that process a lot tougher. there was the old British imperialist, Lord Curzon, who I'm sorry to say is one of my favourites in terms of his observations. Certainly, he sort of said that, before Iran achieves a sort of a modern stable state, it might need to go through a period of fanaticism. He actually says it. He says it might be a period when it will have to relapse into fanaticism before it can release itself forward into that. And, there are people who believe that. There are people who believe that this process of having gone through this sort of period of religious fanaticism, hardliners and whatever, is a necessary thing that you have to transition in order to get through to the other side, to the, the light at the end of the tunnel. The problem is, of course, is that for many Iranians, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a bloody long tunnel.
Yeah.
So people are basically having to pace themselves. I mean, as I said, I was talking to a Dutch colleague of mine who always said to me, he said, I wouldn't worry about it. We went through our Calvinist period too. And it was, and well, yeah, I said, yeah, but that was in the 17th century. I mean, it's, it's
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah. It's kind of like, I find people in general, we kind of always tend to repeat history. We always go like, it's either you always go too far right, or then you go too far left, and then you start coming back and you go more
yeah,
right.
it's a pendulum.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah, I mean,
happening in Europe now. Like there's a lot of far right kind of
yeah,
coming more into
absolutely.
Europe because of
Can be a bit
failures.
worrying, actually.
Yeah, that is true. Because no one can just get to a point where they can go, okay, this is a good middle ground to be. So they either go that way or they just go too far the other way, and it's like we can
I mean,
never just go.
part of the problem, I think, is a relative lack of historical awareness.
Yeah.
Among contemporaries, we all think that this is the worst thing the country's ever been to. I mean, you see this in this country as well, in Britain, and it's people, don't have a appreciation of what was going on in the 70s in this country, or 60 or whatever, or how difficult the 80s were. So, there is that sort of our historical horizons are very, very short. In Iran, it's different, actually. I mean, in Iran, people have longer historical horizons, but they're not terribly nuanced. As I said, it's a bit primary colors. So on the one side, it's all perfidious Albion, or the Great Satan in the United States, and on the other side, the pre-revolutionary period was so rosy and so magnificent that it's sort of like an Eden that we lost.
Yeah.
But of course, for political purposes, those sort of simplistic narratives work. And as I said, the longer this malaise goes on, the more the sort of the comparative prosperity of the pre-1979 period just looks even more and more inviting.
So, like pre-1979, Iran, what was it like in a religious terms? Like, what was it? It's obviously still mostly was an Islamic country, but
yes, but I mean, it wasn't a practice. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah,
They didn't
more
implement it.
secular
So
kind of.
yeah, it was in legal terms, I suppose it was a secular state. But the Shah was a deeply religious man himself. Actually, I mean, he was very religious to the point of superstition. I'm sorry to say.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, because he believed that. I mean, he sort of began to believe that he was
Anointed by God kind of thing, is it?
Well, it wasn't just that. And you're right. Yes, he did feel he had a sort of a spiritual connection, but which his father, by the way, didn't. I mean, his father was quite. So I always draw this comparison. His father, who was basically a product of Iran. I mean, his father was educated in Iran insofar as he had a formal education, but he was ruthlessly pragmatic, very much bought into the nationalist narratives of the time. Right? He was a nationalist, and he didn't believe. He had certain religious beliefs, but he didn't let it sway him, and he had a deep distaste of the clerics, the religious classes. He thought they're all superstitious mumbo jumbo. His son, on the other hand, was educated abroad, was educated in Switzerland and was very fluent in English and French and whatever. But curiously enough, was incredibly superstitious. And while he didn't really like clerics, he didn't like clerics because he thought, I know it better than you guys. You see what I mean? I mean, it's I'm better. You see what I mean?
The ego kind of thing.
Yeah. Whereas his father didn't like the clerics, but didn't make any pretense of anything about religion anyway. The Shah sort of thought, well, no, I'm the Lord's anointed and this sort of thing. So it was, there wasn't a strong religious element to the Shah's worldview, and he did probably invest more and put more money into religious the religious establishment than others. And I mean, one of the ironies, and one of the reasons why the clerical classes basically became dominant after 1979 is because the Shah spent so much time worried about communist insurrection and crushing sort of the left,
Right.
and being quite dismissive of the religious classes in a way. But he thought, well, I can, because actually the religious class is instinctively a monarchist. He thought, big mistake, obviously, but that's the way he felt. But ultimately, it was the religious classes who did him in. But it was partly because I've argued this, that the Shah presented himself so much as some sort of spiritual, sacred monarch that ultimately the people said, well, if you're going to play this game, we might as well get the real thing in. I mean, you see what I mean?
Played his cards too close.
Yeah. And this is why now, the regime is playing a nationalist card very heavily, and because it's now trying to compensate the other way around. And I think ultimately, what people will say, well, if you're going to play this game, let's get the real thing in. I mean, why are we wasting our time with religious people? If actually what you're talking about is nationalism. But the Shah, I mean, I think so. For instance, with the veil, the veil was not obligatory, and in fact, if you wanted to get ahead in government ministries and this, that, and the other, you weren't meant to use the veil. I mean, it wasn't a choice in that sense. But whereas his father had banned the veil altogether, often in quite drastic ways, I have to say. I mean, he didn't tolerate dissent. The son actually said, you can wear the veil if you want, but you're not necessarily going to get into sort of university or whatever. So you had to, for very, very religious people, it was a bar in some ways. But you still saw people in veils around Iran. I mean, throughout the 60s and 70s, and people would wear veils, but they were obviously the very traditional families and whatever. He didn't bar them from wearing it, but obviously, if you wanted to get on in life, you had to, you had to disavow it. And for all intents and purposes, the country, the Shah espoused a very, very strongly nationalist ideology. To give you one example of where he went wrong, unlike his father basically in 1924, before he actually became monarch, instituted a new calendar, or institutionalized a new calendar for Iran. So Iran had always used multiple different calendars. I mean, like in all pre-modern societies, so definitely there was a religious calendar, there was a sort of the solar calendar, there was a lunar calendar, which was the Islamic calendar. And so what the father did is he instituted the solar calendar, the solar year, as the official calendar of Iran, but based on, the dating years-wise was based on the Islamic timetable, basically, from the Prophet of Islam. So that year was effectively the same, but it was a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar. And then the month names were all taken from pre-Islamic Zoroastrian sort of type of angels and others. And that, interesting enough, is the calendar we have to this day. I mean, the Islamic Republic has never changed that calendar. Right. It's the solar calendar with all these names. And that's very interesting to me, because it shows that it must have had a social basis for him to do it. People accepted it. What his son did, unfortunately, is in 1976, very abruptly, he decided that actually we've had enough of this calendar. And basically, although using the same month names and everything, decided to redate it, from the time of the accession of the first Persian monarch, Cyrus the Great, in 559 BC. And so overnight, Iranian suddenly discovered that rather than living in 1355, i.e. the sort of the Islamic dating, they were now living in 2535. And of course, some monarchists loved it. Other people thought it was an act of enormous hubris and madness. And it was, because basically many of the religious people sort of thought, what the hell is this? Why are we suddenly living, it's like, I don't know, it's like dating it, to King Arthur or something. I mean, it was a bizarre way of doing. I mean, it's not the best analogy, but you know what I mean. It's sort of a very much more secular type of thing. So that sort of thing, he was a religious man, but in the worst cases, I mean, in the worst type of thing, because he was very fatalistic, and because he thought the Lord has anointed me, I have got spiritual connection, I can't do any wrong, the minute he realized that he was getting it wrong, rather than address the issue, he suddenly he lost confidence in himself. You see what I mean? He became very, very fatalistic, and thought, oh my God, I've lost the divine blessing, and that's me
Wow.
done.
Wow.
And that's basically what crushed him at the end. I mean, the Islamic Revolution was a success in terms of the overthrow of the Shah, because the Shah lost the will to continue. And he lost the will to continue because it was a psychological breakdown, basically.
Wow.
Do you see what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
if he'd shown half the guts of his father, I don't know what the outcome would have been necessarily. It would have been a much more bloody affair in some ways, but he wouldn't have collapsed in the way that he'd done. I mean, the father was much more robust in that sense, in terms of sticking to his ground. The Shah, of course, had this reputation for, when the going got tough, of sort of packing his bags and leaving. And of course, that's not the
Right.
best way. That's not the best way of sort of encouraging your supporters to hang in there, is it? Really? I mean,
No. You look like a
if they
weak
sort of think,
leader, kind of.
yeah, do you see what I mean? They say, "Oh, we'll stick by him," but
Yeah.
not if he's about to go. And that's what happened. Basically, people realised that he'd lost his nerve, and once they realised he'd lost his nerve, that tipping point then became a sort of an avalanche, a sort of a flood. And I think this is the thing that you see today.
Hmm.
The leadership in Iran is acutely aware of that. That the minute they show weakness, they're finished.
Right.
The minute
Right.
people think, oh, these guys aren't staying, they're finished. And I think that's chipping away. Now, I think the problem with the current regime is because they've learned that lesson, they're digging in very much.
Hmm.
But there is a sort of an attritional quality that you didn't have with the Shah. The Shah was, the Achilles heel of the system
Uh-huh.
was the Shah. And now the Achilles heel of the system is much more complex and will require much more chipping away. But there will come a tipping point as well. And one of the areas is when the current supreme leader dies. I mean, this is the thing: when the current supreme leader dies, that sort of cement, that sort of overarching authority that's kept all these different factional forces in check will have gone, and it will be a very vulnerable period for the system.
Yeah. How does like I was watching that documentary about Iran, and the cops just or police just seem so aggressive. Like some of the stories that they were doing to people, even when they, reprimanded them in custody, was just, absolutely shocking. But obviously the cops have to agree with what they're being told. Is there
Well, some
any
of them. I mean,
dissent?
this is the
Yeah,
interesting thing,
that's what I
and
was
and
asking.
you,
Yeah.
yeah. So what you'll see is that they'll use particular groups to deal
Ah,
with. They
okay.
won't use local. So you have different layers. It's a bit like you see in Europe. I mean, like drawing on France today, for instance. I mean, normally the people who are dealing with the hard-nosed sort of rioting and whatever, they'll
Hmm.
bring these sort of these sort of special military units, special police units that come from other places. They won't necessarily use the local because that's quite difficult. Now in Iran, it's even more layered than that. I mean, and so two things. I mean, quite interesting about what happened in the last round of protests. One of the reasons that the level of fatalities was as low as it was this time round compared to, say, 2019, was that many of the people protesting, of course, were the sons and daughters of the very people doing the enforcement. So it
Right.
became more difficult for them. Do you see what I mean? And we know that
Wow.
from leaked documents. We know
Yeah.
that from leaked that they were saying, it's our sons and daughters out there. I mean, we're not going to shoot them, right? Or we don't want to.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting problem. Uh, the other thing is that, yeah, you're right. There is a hardcore, of course, that do believe in this. I
Mm.
mean, that do believe in this. But how is it that they treat people so badly? It's because they look on them as heretics. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I say that to people. I say, if you look at the language being used, they see them not, so they use the word sedition, but they use the word sedition from an Islamic Quranic element. These are fitna. These are people who are seditionists who are causing civil unrest, and they use the term in a religious connotation. And fitna is caused by heresy. It's caused by people who don't believe. And the minute you're considered a non-believer, you are beyond the pale. Anything goes. And that's why I always say to my European colleagues and others, I said, don't look at these as, secular police force or whatever doing. There are elements in these law enforcement bodies who treat the people they are dealing with as so beyond the pale that anything goes. And if you're going to
Right.
have rape in prison, which we know is going on, if you're going to have, the abuse of women, the abuse of men, we know in 2009, for instance, there was rape going on and torture on both male and female,
Jesus.
why is it? It's because they treat them as effectively subhuman. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the evidence is there of clerics saying that, by the way, of issuing fatwas and judgments and saying these people are so beyond the pale, you can basically take whatever you can do whatever you need to maintain the stability of the Islamic Republic. Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine whether that sort of behavior will maintain the stability of the Islamic Republic. You can bet my view is that actually I'm not going to come away from an experience like that feeling very positive about the Islamic Republic, right? So yes, it's an attempt to break the will and the moral fiber of these individuals. But we know, as history tells us, really, that actually people come back angrier. Yeah. And this is why 2022 was interesting to me. We've had years of suppression, years of it, where they've used these sort of tactics. And yet, lo and behold, again in 2022, a new generation comes up and is wanting to fight for its rights. And that's what's interesting for me. And what people do is that despite, the attempt to keep this down every couple of years, and with increasing frequency, of course, there is a growing, there's an inexorable, I think, sort of march towards a particular sort of demands for rights and others.
Even when you see those little kids, I seen little kids in school, and they were like, kind of
John, did you see the girls?
Amazing,
and a lot of them were veiled. I mean, a lot of them were veiled. They were wearing their veils. And they said, because what they were saying, of course, was not, and this was interesting. It was not actually about removing the veil. It was about the right to choose. Do you see what I mean? And this is what I was trying to explain to people. Some people want to wear the veil. It's absolutely fine. Nobody's saying to you do it. But it's about the right to choose, and it's about them. It's as a colleague of mine said, it's about being sovereign over your own body. Sovereignty over it. This idea that a woman going out into the street shouldn't have to be constantly harassed by some stranger about whether they're, that little bit of hair. That's a bad example with me, obviously, but hair is sort of like is falling out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's an absurd. I mean, I've had the experience when I used to go to Iran. My mother, who was, she was in her 70s at the time, walking around. We were walking around. She had a sort of scarf, and people would come up to her and say, "Look, madam, please, sort out your headscarf." And we thought, bloody hell, she's 75. I mean, what the hell is the problem? I mean, why you her, I mean, in those days, it wasn't as brutal as it is now. Certainly not for, not for someone of my mum's age, but still people got offended. I got offended at it. Why are you interfering? We're walking out, nothing's happening,
Yeah.
And
it's just
yet
control,
it's about power.
Yeah. Do you think the West doesn't understand the Middle East, or just gets a lot of things wrong about the Middle East? Because there is a kind of, I think the West seems to think it knows the Middle East, but obviously I don't think we seem to as much as we think we do.
I think we do. Let me put it this way. I think we have the resources.
Okay.
And the ability to know. Whether we want to know is another matter. I mean, I think there are two separate points here.
Okay. What do you mean by that? Whether we want
to
know?
What I mean is that if you went back, certainly certainly for the French and the British, who have a long, experience in the Middle East, for good or ill. Okay, I'm not making any judgments on that. But nonetheless, there's a huge amount of information, huge amount of data, huge amount of literature. Stretching back a couple of hundred years. And yet, it is true that I think modern politics is so rapid fire, is so short term, that people aren't spending the time really to look back and see what there's, in America as well. America's really runs its politics on the basis of election cycles, which are every 2 years effectively. So there's never really any time to develop that sort of political understanding that's needed. There's plenty of academic understanding, by the way, but sometimes that doesn't really get across. Obviously academic understanding is contentious in many ways. I wouldn't, there are many people who disagree with me. I disagree with them, whatever, we try and encourage that debate. The ability of us to inform policy is, again, an issue, because policy is often driven by certain paradigms that people will shortcut in order to pursue particular policy. I mean, one of the things we have now, for instance, in the bee I have in my bonnet, is that one of the paradigms that shapes Western policy towards the rest of the world, actually, not just the Middle East, is what I call the Nixon to China paradigm, which is essentially that if you engage with autocratic systems and you sort of like work with them, you can bring them in draw them to your side. And this was really the argument with China until recently. It was the argument we saw most explicitly with Russia until recently, the Ostpolitik, let's engage with Russia, bring them in, we'll soften it, and I think that's also been the really, even to this day, actually, a sort of an argument that shaped policy towards Iran, that, obviously, jaw is better than war, absolutely. But it depends what sort of jaw you're talking about. If your jaw is simply saying, let's have a nice cup of tea and aren't you wonderful, and do you mind not raping those people in prison? It would be jolly nice if you didn't. Well, nobody's going to pay any attention to you. Do you know what I mean? It's not. And it's not necessarily either, I would say, that anyone sitting in a Western capital can dictate. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to go around dictating to people. I mean, nobody wants to say that, and we don't want to be preachy about it. But at least you should be, I think, as you've rightly pointed out, at least you should be acutely aware of what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And I would say, I think many people, when you push comes to shove, know exactly what they're dealing with. However, they still maintain this sort of fiction of, well, if we talk to them and we talk to them long enough. And, I remember Amnesty International many years ago, a guy said to me, I think it was Amnesty, and they said, oh, we went over to Iran to talk about human rights and stuff. This was, way back when these things were possible. And they sort of came back slightly sort of, slightly shocked that people in Iran were saying no, flogging's good, it works. We would encourage you to adopt it in the West. As if we're going to go back to the 19th century. Yeah. I mean, but they were very sort of, and there was a sort of an engagement and dialogue going on. But actually, part of the problem was that it wasn't a sort of dialogue that was necessarily going to change their views. I mean, basically they were so confident, so pleased with their own methods, that they thought, well, you should take a few tips from us. Again, it's that sort of thing. Is a simple, are we going to? And I think part of the problem in the West is we're so sort of, I don't know, in a bit of a crisis of self-confidence and identity ourselves, that we're more often than not willing to accept. Yes, you're. So they'll come back and say, well, you did this, you did that, you committed these crimes, and we spend a lot of time actually just saying, yes, you're absolutely right. We were very wicked to you in the past and this sort of thing. Well, I think there's room for that within a sort of a more abstract academic debate. I don't think it should shape policy.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, I get you.
I don't think it works it works very well for them. So during the whole, nuclear negotiations, one of the things that came up very strongly were basically Americans saying that, they were sort of explaining the reason why they had to get to an agreement with Iran, not on the basis of the very valid reasons of nuclear, proliferation, but basically because, oh yes, in 1953 we helped overthrow the, nationalist Prime Minister Mossadegh in a coup in 1950. Therefore, we owe Iran in a sense. I mean, a very bizarre way to, to devise policy. I think there's a valid debate to be had on that. Of course there is, but it's not the way you shape policy, because, what you could say is, well, the Iranians then took, 44 American diplomats hostage. Was it 44 or 53? I can't remember. But certainly for over a year.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of blame to go around, by the way. I mean, it's not, politics is a messy business and it's not great. But I don't think you want to shape your policy, your current policy, on guilt about the past.
Yeah.
I think it should inform it, by the way. I think you should understand where you're coming from in the relation with that country. That's fine. But I don't think it should dictate what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because all sorts of things can happen. And for me, I used to say to people, it would make a lot more sense that if Iran was a secular democracy that emulated the ideals of former Prime Minister Mossadegh, then I would say, yes, there is room for a sort of like an apology or a this or that or the other. But while you have a regime in place that actually doesn't give two hoots about Prime Minister Mossadegh, other than to make you feel guilty, I wouldn't play that game.
I think the West, it does feel, it has this certain guilt, I think, about a lot of things. And I think that's kind of, I think over time, it's kind of been a downfall for the West, because I think a lot of other, we'll say, outside of the West, people view the West as being rather weak and kind of soft. And I know for sure Ireland were viewed as very soft because we were like, Irish, sure, it'll be grand. You know, that's like, which is not a good way to be, really, because you know what I mean? Like, eventually, it's not going to work out well for you.
Yeah,
And
no, I agree with that. Actually, I mean, I do. I mean, you guys aren't. I mean, is there sort of feeling now that night? I don't know. I mean, this is slightly off piste, of course, but Ireland's always kept resolutely. I mean, you're not part of NATO, are you? So I mean, it's not.
no,
You're always a neutral. But at the
yes,
same time, you know,
they're
I think
trying
you
to, they're,
rely a lot on, obviously the
yeah,
protection that NATO will offer. So, but it's true that I used to get, this view that, they said that, because of Ireland's relationship with Britain, many
mhm,
Iranians, from the Islamic Republic would say, "Oh, well, let's go to Dublin. It's great. The Irish are great because they all hate the British." Now, well, yes and no, but what I was sort of saying to them, yeah, but that doesn't mean that the Irish have values that are close to you. I mean,
yeah,
do you see what I mean? I mean,
yeah,
there are different dynamics going on here. And I agree, there's an element where I think people can be pigeonholed and sort of slot into things which are just completely unworkable. I mean, and I think one has to be careful. There is a debate about history to be had. Of course there is. And I wish as a historian, that people were more aware of it and more engaged with it.
mhm,
But I'm just as critical in some ways of as I said, the sort of primary colors that come from either perspective, that tend to see things in a very, very simplistic narrative
yeah,
and see them things as, saints and villains. I mean, it's never as easy as that. It's never as
yeah.
easy as that.
There's no angels on any side. Like
Exactly. I mean, this
that's
is the problem. I think we have to acknowledge that. I got into an interesting, when you look at the whole debate over there was the thing about the coronation, George, the Kohinoor diamond. And there's a whole business in India where they say the Kohinoor needs to be restored to
yeah,
Indians.
yeah, yeah.
But of course, what people were forgetting is actually the Iranians think the Kohinoor belongs to them. so, I said, well, the Indians can shout as much as they want, but
Yeah,
actually the Iranians are going to come to the Indians and say, actually, no, it belongs to us. You stole it from us.
yeah.
So again, it's a slightly more complicated.
If
You can
you
get into binds over this, and I
exactly,
think that the lack of clarity from the West, certainly the lack of certainty, and certainty is perhaps too strong a term, but certainly a certain amount of confidence means that we haven't been able to engage. To go back to your main point, we haven't been able to engage with autocracies as a whole with as much clarity as we should, and I think that's been very clear with Russia, by the way. Been
yeah,
very clear with Russia, but
yeah.
Iran is another case.
If you speaking of the coronation, if you want to watch something funny, you can see if Google Alan Partridge coronation, and it's Alan Partridge doing the whole, like, commenting on the whole
Oh, really?
coronation. Oh, dude, it's so funny. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, it's funny. It's really funny. And
I'll
on
have to
that,
have a look at that.
that could be a beautiful note to finish on.
Is that all right?
Hey, thank you so much for doing this. Have a good
Brilliant.
day,
Thanks,
man.
Paul. Take
Cheers,
care.
brother. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.